Hello, everyone.
He
Hello, hello.
Hi.
I just dropped the agenda notes doc in. If you wouldn't mind putting yourself in if you're here, and don't add yourself if you're not here. I like how Zoom puts me next to my name in case I forget who I am.
Wait, what do you mean?
So in the participants list, it says Ben Cotton Kusari Inc. and then it has parentheses me. Which I mean that could actually be helpful if there are multiple people with the same name, you know which one it is, but it is kind of amusing at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like they have that problem in some of the open SSF meetings. There are too many Michaels.
Yeah. I was like, when I worked at Red Hat, we had, I think, at least four Matthew Millers, maybe six.
Howdy, folks.
Hello.
Uh,
Hello.
I'll give folks just another minute or two to roll in. It's snowing where I am for the first time today, and I'm very upset about this.
I thought
Same
the
here in
first snow
Germany.
is. Sorry.
What was that, Brandon?
I always thought the first snow was like the nice one. Where you're like, oh, I haven't seen this in a while, and then it gets tiring after.
No, I hate it. I could just live in the tropics, but I don't. I live in Indiana instead.
In Germany, there was the first snow today as well, but I'm pretty happy
Nice.
about it. Better than gray weather.
Yeah, I mean, at least this one, the ground is warm enough that it's not sticking to like the sidewalks and the road and stuff, so I don't have to go clear it off. But
Be okay with no snow ever again. Maybe on TV or something, or a background with snow in it.
alrighty, well, I think we can get started. I'll paste the link in one more time because I'm not sure if Zoom has scroll back or not. So if you've just joined, uh, we have the agenda, and if you could put your name in so that we remember that you were here. We'll go ahead and get started, and with the usual reminders that this meeting is recorded and will be posted to the GUAC YouTube channel. And this is an OpenSSF project meeting subject to the OpenSSF Code of Conduct and the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. Before we dig into stuff, is there anybody who's new or hasn't been here in a long time that would like to introduce themselves?
I would start.
Okay.
First time here. So I'm Lucas. I'm based in Germany, and I'm working for a German cloud provider called Stackit. And yeah, I was watching the GUAC repository for I think 1 year by now. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
Well, we're happy to have you. I know you've been pretty active in the repo recently, so it's good to see you. Brant, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, I'm Brant Keller. I work for a company called Defense Unicorns. Particularly, we do just a large focus on the public sector, and we see a lot of prevalence in this space of like the problem set of what GUAC helps solve for, but also then some of the nuances that comes with operating in some of these environments. And so, had some great discussions at KubeCon. Want to continue those discussions and yeah, try to assist with contributing some of those back where possible.
Great, and we're happy to have you here. Anyone else? Alrighty. So we don't need to talk about it in great length, I don't think, but there have been several releases since our meeting last month. I've added the links to the release notes in the doc for all of them. The two big things that I picked up on were adding an HTTP handler to display the version string, which has allowed the experimental GUAC visualizer to be a little more descriptive. So you know what version of GUAC you're using along with the visualizer. We need to tidy up a couple things, and then we'll probably do a release of the visualizer here soon. But there's also some new batch querying support for a few of the nodes for is dependency, certify vuln, and certify legal. Parth or any of the other maintainers, is there anything you want to add as a note on the recent releases?
No, I think that sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that covers
s-
it.
Sorry, Puff.
Yeah,
Speaking of things from the maintainers, we came to a decision to cancel the GUAC time office hours. It's due to low attendance. We do have, of course, this meeting every month and weekly maintainer meetings on Mondays. Those are still, public and recorded to the YouTube channel as well. And I think, the maintainers are generally pretty receptive to, scheduling one-off conversations if we need to discuss certain things. And of course, we can always talk about stuff in the Slack channel. So we just, felt like since people weren't showing up, it wasn't worth having. Any questions or comments on that? Alrighty. Well, I know Brandon has to leave in the bottom of the hour, so he wanted to give an update on some of the refactor stuff that the maintainers have been talking about recently. So Brandon, I'll give it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Well, get the sharing working. Puff, do you want to say something just now? I feel like I talked over you.
no, all good.
Okay. Cool. So at the past couple maintainer meetings, we've been chatting a little bit about, so these meetings are the ones that happen every Monday. A little bit about, lessons we've learned, the feedback that we've gotten around GUAC, and trying to make it easier to use and more usable by other folks. And also, like, as we were progressing towards 1.0, right? I think we looked at what we had, and we looked at things like ingestion and data quality and data handling, and we're like, yeah, those parts are really solid. I think in terms of some interfaces with the GraphQL, I think we got some feedback that people didn't really like using GraphQL. It's hard to learn. And then we had some feedback that like, oh, it's very difficult to actually get started and start experimenting with things. And so as part of this, we were trying to figure out like, okay, let's split up, scoping what's mature and stable, and make it more usable for the parts that people do not like. We kind of let's iterate on that continuously. But at the same time, if there are users, such as like Red Hat Kusari, more folks on the call that want to use GUAC, let's be able to provide a solid interface and have that stability be easier used. So we've kind of made a shift in terms of um, so-called the audience that we're serving the project, right? I think initially the idea was like, okay, here's an entire solution, use it. You put in documents, you get insights out. What we noticed was that we don't only have that one audience, but we also have like solution providers, right? The Red Hat product. I can't remember what the name of the product is. Um, but the one that Tijan and Marco Rizzi and folks are working on is like, okay, we're gonna take like the database of GUAC, and then we're gonna do some other insights on it, right? So we realized that there were more than one customer, and making it delivering an interface that's usable for them to then go build solutions on top of the graph database is also helpful. So with that in mind, we're kind of focusing on three main areas. One is make it easy for solution providers to build solutions on top of GUAC. Make it easier to kind of on-ramp into GUAC without having to build out a graph. I think that's one of the feedback that we get. It's like, all right, like I want to see what GUAC can do, but I don't want to have to like go integrate with every OCI registry and every single SFORM that I have in order to get that to see what I can do with it. And finally, the last part is on insights, right? I think this is somewhere that we've tried to build with the GraphQL. It hasn't quite formed its shape yet. We see like everyone asking slightly different questions, and so this is an area where we want to continue building, but we want to keep it a little bit more compartmentalized. to kind of the ingestion and then the database ontology and schema. This may seem a lot, but I'm gonna share the next slide, which may may kind of make a lot more sense. Which is we are planning to split this into 3 different parts. In terms of like what you know today is kind of like the GUAC graph, right? You install something, it has all the collectors and all the ingesters. It delivers you a graph, and then you make GraphQL queries to the graph. What we are planning to do is to split this up into the GUAC ingestion. So have the ingestion pipeline of taking the data and outputting it to a standard schema be separate from the construction of the graph itself, right? So the inputs of these would be the metadata document, the SBOM, the vectors. The output would just be a JSON or protobuf. So this lets you have a little bit more language agnostic, or if you just want to experiment with something, you can do that. And this will then, like, the output of the GUAC ingest will feed into the GUAC graph, right? And this is when, like, if you're more committed to let me ingest my entire organization's data and be able to kind of ask questions about my entire fleet, that's when you want to have a graph to kind of bring everything in. And so GUAC ingest will be like a starting point for folks that want to just play around with it, see what the GUAC ontology gives to it. For more advanced users, like, let's integrate it with my infrastructure, and then I get a query interface out of it. And finally, we have the GUAC Insights bit, which today kind of is seen as our CLIs. So these are like, give me information about how this vulnerability affects my fleet, patch planning, and things like that all fall into GUAC Insights. So the hope is decomposing the project into 3 subcomponents. Ingest, graph, and insights will help kind of let people kind of more pick and choose to see what fits their needs. Before I go into more detail, do you have any questions? Ben, do you have a hand up?
Yep. So I guess, part of it is how much work will this take, and, what kind of help do we need from people who aren't currently contributing in order to make this work?
That's a good question. And I think part of it is kind of creating the kind of splitting out the systems. I would say that there is a little bit of work that we need to do in terms of taking the current GraphQL ontology and converting it to a protobuf ontology. I think in that sense, we want a lot of feedback and also maybe contributions in terms of like, oh, how are you using this data? And on top of that, I think there is definitely help in terms of now with the GUAC graph separate from the ingestion, that we open ourselves up to not having the GraphQL interface. So that's where we can start designing, okay, how do we expose a SQL schema or a Cypher schema? And I think that is where we are hoping the community can help us with, to say, like, this is how we'd like to use the graph interface. And I know a lot of, like, for example, Dijon and crew have been using like the NGO SQL interface directly, and they've had experience with that. So I think we are looking forward to a lot of feedback on like how we can design that a little bit better. Yeah, but more details in the next few slides. So hopefully that will give some ideas as well. So a quick idea of roadmap, right? I think the whole point of kind of splitting this up is, what we have today is the GUAC graph that kind of encompasses everything. This is still something that we wanna create a V1 so that folks can start using GUAC in their production clusters. So the only minor difference is this V1 compared to what you see in Hit today is that we will have the query interface be the end SQL instead of the GraphQL interface. So we are making that statement where, hopefully in a year you never have to ever deal with GraphQL in the GOG project. So the only change there is just saying, okay, here we're gonna have the graph BV1, we're gonna have the SQL directly exposing end. At the same time, we're gonna work on so-called the V2 ontology, right? So this is a protobuf / JSON specification. So the idea is you put in a file, you get JSON out, you get a protobuf out. And then further along, once the new interface is done, we can have the graph kind of optionally, basically transparently adapt to the new interface, right? The JSON proto should be compatible with the GraphQL, and so in this way, we can kind of almost like silently make the change, and then users should not be impacted by that at all. And, version 2 will just be like, we're gonna totally burn every single piece of GraphQL left that we have in the repo. But that would be a little bit of waste, right? So, but this is just kind of deprecating the old interface. And the insights bit, I think, with especially what we've seen with like the GUAC visualizer and the different CLIs, this will still be. We are not looking to create specific versions of this yet, and this will kind of still be. This is not something that we're looking to package up, but because of the interfaces that we are creating around the SQL and the new GUAC ontology, this should be relatively stable. So I'm gonna really quickly go through like what does this look like, right? GUAC ingest. This is kind of the big refactor, taking that out of the GUAC graph as its individual component. And the idea here is like you can just say, okay, I want to cat my SBOM, pipe it to GUAC ingest, use JQ, and do things with it. You can do the same thing and say like, oh, augment it. And this is kind of what we do with like certifiers, where I'm going to put in depth of depth information. I'm going to put in vulnerability information or licensing information as part of passing the SBOM, and then do things with it, right? And all you can do what we do today, which is let's convert it to the ontology, and so that can then be taken as a sample into graph, which people can which we can then query via SQL. And so the idea is, with a standard ontology, it's easy for users to kind of get started to say like, okay, I have SBOM, I put it to GUAC ingest, and now with these, I can just say like, select, give me everything that has SBOM that has curl, right? So this basically says, give me all SBOMs that contain a curl package. And you have another one that says, like, give me all predicates about my container image. So you can say, let me select all predicates where there is an object that's referencing this particular poll. And just as a quick demo, if this will work. Right. So, oops. So I think this example I have is like, oh, you can't see the end of my screen. So this is the second example that I had. So let's cat it and then select objects that are related to this container image. And so if I do this, I can see, okay, yeah, I have a SBOM that's related to that image because it's a subject. I also have a point of contact that's related to this because it is a subject of um, that predicate as well. The other example that I said around curl, for example, we can do cat JSON. Oops, did I do that right? Yeah. And so in this case, we only have one SBOM within the set of predicates that has an object that has curl. So in this case, we can see that it matched because of this particular package, which is in the dot values are included software predicate field in the SBOM predicate. And I think just a quick one. So this is kind of what it looks like today with the pipeline, with the GraphQL ingestion into the GraphQL assembler. This is just showing like what the graph v1 will be, where we are dropping the GraphQL and just saying, okay, here's the database. And then we can, these two Nick's diagrams are showing how we can transparently migrate from GraphQL to the JSON ontology, like behind the scenes, without impacting our users. Yeah. And finally, insights. Now that we have two different ways to get to the GUAC ontology, either via the GUAC graph and GUAC ingest. We also have the GUAC and the visualizer, all the different CLIs and things like that. And the idea is that you would be able to get the ontology both from GUAC ingest exposing the JSON structs, or you would be able to do it via querying the SQL as well. The big question here is like maybe you have to create a library to unify these interfaces a little bit better. I think that's the open question. But the idea here is then, you'd be able to have the vendor solutions on top of these things, whether or not you're using the GUAC graph or just the ingestion. And I think that's it I had for this topic. Yes, let me share the slides. Here you go. Awesome. I know there was quite a bit, but any questions, any feedback? Especially if the feedback is like, what the hell are you doing? Like, don't ruin the project. Yeah.
Hey, Brandon.
Hey, we're done.
I mean, I think this makes sense. Like the GraphQL is probably the toughest piece. So again, kind of just confirming what you're saying. So it's definitely the hardest part that we found of getting folks to actually use it. So I think it's the right call.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was just wanted to get a sense of what the protobuf approach kind of looks like. Is there any sort of thinking as to how that part's going to work?
So I think if you are still using the graph interface, like the end backend and things like that, that should be transparent. So you shouldn't have to worry about it. So you're still we are still gonna have like the end backend, or that will be converted to more generic Postgres backend. But in terms of the protobuf ontology, right? I think this is where if you do want to create your own backend, you can use the protobuf will look kind of pretty much look like a serialized GraphQL of what you have today. We are planning to make some improvements to make kind of querying it directly easier rather than I think one of the things that we learned from the GraphQL interface is like, oh yeah, we don't really need that much hierarchy in terms of software identifiers. Like no one was really pointing at like the GitHub.com or like the GitHub.com organization. Everyone was just like, oh, I care about projects. So likely we will not have that much structure, so it's easier to kind of work with those things. But I think largely it would still look the same as what the GraphQL definitions are today. So in terms of the fields and the expressiveness.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense to me. I think I'm more interested in like essentially the ingest path now will, instead of calling GraphQL, it will, I guess, send just almost like a gRPC call. Like, I guess I think that's the part that I'm a little bit fuzzy on, but maybe I missed it. I joined the call a little late, so I could have. This could be something rehashing that I already.
So in a sense, I think the infrastructure of the GUAC graph will still use the same, like there will still be the collectors. That's not going away. The collectors will, instead of like calling the libraries, will use this new library, and then the backend. So I think a lot of this is really under the hood. I think if you're using the interface of the graph, which is like, I'm going to install a bunch of collectors, I'm going to set up my Kubernetes cluster and a GCP bucket or a S3 bucket, like that's all going to stay the same. You shouldn't need to change anything.
Totally. I think I'm interested from the perspective of like the implementation of like a backend, right? Because I think we're talking about implementing a GraphQL server that persists to like a proprietary graph database. So in the event that we want to be like, okay, instead of implementing GraphQL server, what is it that we would want to implement essentially, right? Something that adheres to that protobuf contract,
Right.
which I think totally makes sense. I think that's the right approach because generally speaking, this ingestion is just service to service. So having it go over GraphQL always felt a little, I guess, like too much for what is necessary. But I think that's the part that I'd like to key in on. And if there's going to be more documentation and stuff, we don't have to discuss it now. We can kind of flesh out offline.
There'll be more to come. Don't.
Awesome.
And yeah, we will be discussing this on the maintainer calls that will be coming up. I do have to drop, but I think if there are more questions, I think the other maintainers should be able to answer them. So, right, sorry.
Thanks, Brandon. All right. So just wanted to give a quick recap of KubeCon. I know Parth and Mihai presented a talk at SigStoreCon. The talk is online now, so I included the link in the notes here. And then GUAC as a project got mentioned in 3 separate keynotes on Thursday. We had a big spike in our web traffic that day. I don't know if the keynotes are online yet from KubeCon, but I will definitely make sure those get added into the notes for the record once they are. Parth or Tim or anyone who was there, do you want to add anything else? Sounds like a no. All right.
No, I was waiting for Parth, but no, it's pretty.
Cool.
It was pretty cool. Again, the shadows were great, but we did have a lot of folks curious about it, interested in it, and so yeah, I'd love to see if we can channel them here.
All right. And then so next up, Lucas, I know you were asked to talk about ingesting Trivy SBOM reports into GUAC. So I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. So a bit of background in regards why I did implement this. So we are using the Trivy operator in a lot of our clusters. And yeah, so some of the collectors like using S3 buckets or something like that is currently not very feasible for us because we would need to extract data from the Trivy operator. So the CRDs it generates into S3 files, and then the collector could download it from there. But I was thinking, because the operator has a webhook integration, we could do some, like glue server that takes some of the CRDs that the operator creates and then just ingests them into GUAC documents. So I did prepare a little demo. If I share my screen, let me know if you can see it.
Yep. I
Okay.
see the
So-
terminal.
Yes. Okay. So in the left window, I've got the operator, which is set up with the webhook broadcast URL, which is pointing to the sort of glue server that I wrote. And this is running in a container that is configured to store into GUAC. So with the blobstar address and the pubsub address. And once I start the operator, it will create the CRDs, so the SBOM reports and vulnerability reports, and then the server handles them to ingest them into GUAC. So if it compiles and runs, okay, we see a lot of logs in here. So it's a very early stage of implementation. But what I have here in the bottom is watching the SBOM reports and vulnerability reports in the default namespace. And there currently are none. So when I create a, for example, Nginx pod that will get scheduled in the default namespace, the operator, so the Trivy operator will run and create these reports. And then the handler ingests them into GUAC. So when I pull up the visualizer, let me grab it here. Okay, where is it now? So there I have, for example, in the OCI and then Nginx, I can see that my Nginx OCI package was ingested with all the packages that were reported by the Trivy scan. And also the vulnerabilities get ingested as well. So for example, if I go now into the vulnerability report of Nginx, let's get it here. Vulnerability report, Nginx. I can see that there is, for example, a CVE in util Linux extra. And if I now go into the Linux utils extra, I can see that the vulnerabilities are here ingested as well. Let me get back. So if I inspect this here, I can see that it is from the, I call it Trivy operator collector, but it is basically just the glue server. So this is how we get our information from the Kubernetes clusters into GUAC. And what we were thinking about using this as well is to get some sort of information on which workload is actually, or which packages are actually deployed in clusters. So for example, we could then have some more information about whether a vulnerability that is discovered in packages is actually deployed in which clusters. So to get some like inventory aspect from GUAC. Yeah, and that's basically it. If you have some questions, let me know.
So is the Trivy scan giving us a runtime SBOM then in that case?
Yes.
Or just,
so
just
it
scanning
does,
the image?
it has several modes. So, for example, if there is no SBOM attached to the container image by the, for example, how cosine does attachment for SBOMs, then it will generate a new SBOM. But if there is a SBOM in the registry, it will just use the existing SBOM and report it to us.
Okay. So it would basically do an image scan though, right?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. I see. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I think Brendan's not on the call anymore. We chatted with the Cubescape maintainers also. It has similar functionality to Trivy. And what they were doing is that they were generating an SBOM, but they could also basically it was more of a runtime SBOM. So they could tell you which of the packages were actually being used on runtime. So it actually gives you a whole list of packages that come back basically. I believe they were using eBPF and all that kind of stuff behind the scenes. But basically it gives you a runtime, like, hey, these are the packages that is touching at runtime. At the same time, it also gives you a network report of like what ingress and egress traffic that's kind of happening. So it does similarly, like I think how we showed it. It becomes a CRD, a Kubernetes object, and it drops the SBOM runtime SBOM there. So one of the thoughts we were having is like we could use that information. So I think like Alex and Ridwan, I think especially Ridwan, I think you created this issue first for is deployed. So we that is something we could use. It's like could tie it back to the or the Trivy operator, right? Either of the two, but like basically tied back to like, hey, yeah, it is running. And then, along with Cubescape, what you could do is like now with that information, can you compare the build time SBOM with the runtime SBOM, see what the differences are, right? That's something you could analysis you could do. At the same time, they also produced VEX, right, of all the vulnerabilities that were there. And based off the information about is the package being touched at runtime, they also annotated the VEX document saying like, yeah, this is not being used at runtime, for example. So that could help a lot with the prioritization of like, oh yeah, this, at runtime, this particular package is actually not being used, or for example, so even if it has a vulnerability, it's not actually being run, right? So stuff like that is some of the information that we got from the Cubescape. Again, we haven't done much work. This is something we were thinking about, doing a POC. Jeff, who's not on the call, I think he may be, I think we were interested in doing like a KubeCon EU talk around this. So I think that's something kind of we want to work towards. But yeah, just some thoughts there. But this is great too. Yeah, this might be another option. It's like if a lot of people have the Trivy operator running, and if you just want to know where things are running, then we could correlate that information, right? Like the same way you did. Like if you have it integrated directly with GUAC, then when it ingests that information, you can be like, oh yeah, yes, I know because the Trivy operator is reporting back that it's deployed here, right? It's running here. Then I can have is deployed node gets created for us. So that might be a
for example,
good integration. And and you're ingesting directly via the webhook, is that right? You said?
Yeah, so the webhook ingests into GUAC with the library itself. So with the GUAC functions, yes.
Awesome. Interesting.
So I have a quick question, guys. Sorry, my name's Hari. I actually use Trivy and GUAC, and I actually submit the SBOMs that I generate using Trivy into GUAC and use that for analysis. So I was looking into Trivy operators. So we basically put this in our cluster with like all the GitLab runners and so on and so forth, and it'll generate like observability metrics and so on. And then also that's like a deliverable that GUAC will ingest. Is that am I on par with my thought process?
Yes, that would be a use case that would be usable for this webhook sort of thing. So to bridge the gap between the Trivy operator and GUAC.
Okay, gotcha. That's awesome. No, this is a great meeting to join then. Thank you. And so it's a webhook, so whenever I hit the webhook, it'll automatically update. Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah. Useful. Will it reference the Java database that Aqua Secure or Trivy provides with it? Or it's like vex scans and everything? Because right now my SBOMs use that and it puts the vex vulnerabilities into the SBOM itself.
Yeah, so the Trivy operator has a lot of configuration. Basically, it just generates Trivy scans on the fly. So for every image that is detected in workload, so pod, deployment, stateful set, etc., it will generate a Trivy job, and you can configure it to also use a vex repository, for example, and vex data, and or also use the Trivy client server architecture. For example, we do this a lot because we want to get a lot of cache hits because we have a lot of clusters which run similar workload. So we have one central Trivy server running that is connected to by a lot of clients running in the clusters.
Gotcha. Now, what if I was operating within an air-gapped environment and I was basically caching the Java database and everything, and it might be a little bit old? Would it still operate if I could send the webhook internally within that network?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Just adding on complexity, right? But appreciate the guidance, yeah. That's it for me. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Anything else on this one?
That's awesome. I'm not sure that. No, I think that's good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So we mentioned there's a few kind of cool contributions that are in progress. One of them is from Robbie Cronin, who is it's about 5:45 a.m. where he is, so he's clearly not on the call. Parth, did you or somebody have anything to point out or say with this, or?
Yeah, I mean, he's been
The
adding a lot.
OCI?
Yeah, the OCI collector especially. I think he's done a great job at that. I think Readmon originally started that work. So I think he kind of pushed it over the finish line. So that's great to see that one's completed. And then since then, I think he's just been adding more and more functionalities on the OCI, as well as I think he has some ideas about expanding out some of the backends and all that kind of stuff. So it's too bad that we can't talk to him because of the whole time difference stuff. So maybe we'll create like a one-off meeting, or maybe he can join the maintainers call. I think so. We'll see.
All right. And then Lucas, the other one here was the additional metadata for vulnerabilities from OSV. Did you want to talk about what's going on with that real quick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So basically, what we currently do when we fetch additional metadata for vulnerabilities from OSV, we basically just ingest the vulnerability predicate with the attestation with just the IDs of the vulnerabilities. And the OSV API has a lot more information that we could use.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, the vulnerability attestation also has a field for severity and also the method that was used to calculate this severity score. And what I did is I did create a option to fetch this additional metadata to just ingest the attestations with the severity included, so that, for example, we can use this information to filter out critical vulnerabilities or query, especially not critical vulnerabilities, but low vulnerabilities with a low score, or have a sort of filter on just vulnerabilities that have a very high score, for example 9 or higher, that is rated critically. And yeah, that was sort of the idea to use that.
Yeah, I'm glad you did this. This was something that like I was thinking about like for the longest time, and then always got sidetracked. But this is a great addition. So like you said, it helps with the prioritization of some of these vulnerabilities. And I think there are multiple scores. I'm not sure if OSV does it do EPSS and all those other kind of things? I
No,
wasn't
it
sure
just,
about that.
I think it just does CVSS. So
Okay.
CVSS 3 and 3.1.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. So and then this could be expanded if I don't know if people are based on use cases again. That's why we haven't kind of gone down this route. It's like if we do support other scores like EPSS and things like that. So it's like, if that is something people care about, then we can always have another certifier that could pull in that kind of information if they wanted to. But this is great already. So I just want to make sure that PR is ready for review again, or was there anything left on that one?
I actually had.
There's-
Yeah,
Brendan, you're back.
I'm back. That's a quick meeting. Um, I think there was my comment was around like the vol metadata has a vulnerability score, and then there's a timestamp in the vulnerability metadata input spec.
Yeah.
I think my question was like, that seems to be, is that the time that seems to be like the timestamp for which the report was updated, right? Can we use the OSV last modified timestamp there, or rather than, I think right now it's set as just the current time?
Yeah, so basically what my idea was is so the attestation has the field from the scanner. I think it's scanner and then scanned on and scan finished on. So that would be the two fields that we could populate in the attestation. But I'm not sure how they actually correlate to the modified and published fields from the OSV API. Because that was not clear to me what you meant populating these fields.
Oh, I see now. So this population of the vulnerability metadata input spec is just from the bounds attestation. It's not from the.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So we would need to sort of mock it there and just put it there and then use it from there. But I'm not sure if it's actually the correct field to use in the attestation.
Yeah, because the timestamp.
Because the timestamp field there, so the scan started on and scan finished on. So how, for example, Trivy uses it records when the Trivy scan started and when the Trivy scan finished, and then it puts this information into the attestation and not the ones from the vulnerabilities itself.
Okay. Is that field optional actually? Because I feel like if it's optional, because this metadata.
I'm not sure if the spec mentions something about it. If it's optional, let me have a look. No, it is required, so it has to be set. But I think.
Under whether because the bounds has a last database last updated, maybe we can use that as well. I think if there isn't a straightforward answer from here, I think just having it as now is fine.
Yeah, I would see it in the DB last update field more than in the scanner fields. So maybe something like so the modified timestamp put into the DB last update, that could work.
I just worried like we'll end up populating so many of these nodes for the same for the same severity and score, just with a little bit of difference. But I don't think that's a big deal. So I think now that I have a little bit more clarity that this is just for the monetization, then I think we can keep it as it is then.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Alrighty, anything else? All right, then we'll go to the last topic, which is probably one that will be the topic of discussion for a while. But Brant, you wanted to bring up the issue you opened about air gap support?
Yes, absolutely. It's already come up in discussion today. I think there's a lot of. I think I'm biased. I really like the air gap problem set because it's a nuanced space of like chicken and eggs everywhere. And so I've got to talking with others at KubeCon about the problem statement for GUAC and air gap support. There comes with a lot of nuances of like connectivity to data that is required to like maybe perform some of the native function of GUAC. But if we think about, I think the OpenSSF space, we have GUAC, we have Zarf as projects, and I think that there's different layers we could start to approach for like what the air gap support for GUAC inside of an air gap space looks like. Mainly just wanted to raise the issue because with every single scanner that has come into the cloud native space, there usually is some like assumptions made about like how does the vulnerability data get into the air gap, and then how do you continually update that data so that it gets back into the air gap in a way that meets kind of the security requirements at the end of the day. And we've seen a large disparity between the optimal solution, just the data is the only thing that needs to be updated, and other scanning solutions, which are like we bake it into the executable, and that comes with ramifications or implications, if you will. And so nonetheless, wanted to like get the topic started. I'd love to like start running down like just the deployment mechanism of collect the artifacts you need in order to deploy GUAC to connected or disconnected systems with something like Zarf. And then from there, continue to refine my understanding of GUAC and some of those requirements with the help of you all to say, okay, well, what does day 2 look like? Like, how do you collect scanning data and get it packaged on the connected side for delivery to the disconnected side? So open to as much or as little conversation as people want to have today, given the time. But nonetheless, fascinating problem set, and I would love to help.
Yeah, I mean that is very, like especially for the stuff that it kind of reaches out to, for example, clearly defined as one, OSV, all that kind of stuff. I think figuring out good ways to package that for air gap is going to be huge. And I'm not sure what's the best method to go down that route. So I think that's something we definitely need help with. So,
From my perspective, and Brent, thank you for bringing this up. It's a surprise, but so the big difference between an environment in the SCIF and in our unclassified environment is the data. It's the classified data. And so we try to replicate, or we try to maintain them to be exactly the same. So we have similar infrastructure in both ways. At least from a federal contracting side, there's this legislation called SSDF. That's like the rules that the feds are basically saying, hey, follow this for secure software development. And Zarf looks awesome, but a lot of it is, of course, moving the parts between the unclassified environment, which is connected to the internet. We can do whatever we want, into the air gap space where it's basically a black hole. And the remediation is a little bit harder in a SCIF than when you have internet as well. So I mean, maybe that's a little context. I feel like you already knew a lot of that, though. Yeah.
Is the data flow only one way from unclassified to classified, or can we get classified? I'm assuming getting the classified
One way,
information
yeah.
out.
It never comes out of that room. It'll go to the feds, but it'll never come back to the unclassified environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the nice thing that we have is like we can pick whichever components, right? I think the graph itself can almost be on its own offline, and it's just like the different collectors that you run. Maybe instead of like reaching out to OSP, we would run kind of like the Trivy um a Trivy collector that puts the data in there.
Yeah, I mean that's what the operator I thought that was pretty cool. Because that fits like that use case at least for me. But also personally, the
Mm.
Java database infrastructure, that's pretty unique to Trivy that you guys have. Like no other SBOM scanning tool really has that database mechanism. So being able to cache that within our registry and just have that as a source has been helpful as well.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, I know we're like a minute off time, so definitely an interesting topic. I think we definitely want to talk about it more. We can probably set up a separate meeting with everyone that's kind of interested. We can announce it on the the Slack channel and set up a meeting that way, so you don't have to wait for the next community call or something. So let's continue the conversation on Slack, and we can find a a mutual time that kind of works for everybody. But I think most people on the call seem like they're interested in one way or another. So it's definitely worth figuring out an architecture plan and how do we kind of start this process. So
Awesome.
All right.
Sounds great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So with that, we have reached the end of the hour and the end of the agenda at the same time, which is pretty awesome. Not much in the way of upcoming events right now. We do have our weekly maintainer meeting next Monday, of course, because that happens every week or just about. The next community meeting is scheduled for Thursday, December 19th. These always happen on the third Thursday of the month. We managed to, hopefully avoid when most people being gone for the winter holidays. But we'll, plan on having that meeting then. And Parth, I can take ownership of trying to schedule a special meeting just for discussing the air gap support, what that would look like. Until then, I thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you around the community. Take care.
Good one, y'all.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.